Hello and welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Friday, September 22nd. It's also a great pleasure to be joined virtually in our remote studio by Matt Dunne, who is no stranger to GNAT. Matt is the founder and executive director of the Center on Rural Innovation, which he launched back in 2017. It's a nonprofit organization that partners with rural leaders across the country to build tech economies that support scalable entrepreneurship and lead to more tech jobs in rural America. Matt, welcome back to GNAT.
Great to be with you.
It's always a pleasure to have you on our program and to talk about rural issues, rural economies, particularly when it comes to the tech sector. And we're also going to dive a little bit into tech and climate today. Part of I guess, we've been doing a couple of programs around resilience building measures in connection with climate change, inspired in no short measure by the flooding we saw right here in Vermont back in July. Montpelier, Barrie, Londonderry, Weston, several other communities were hit hard by that storm that came through, and it's been interesting to kind of look at how we build back better after that, or do we just build back? Seems to be the question. But anyway, I thought just to kind of get our conversation started, because we want to talk a little bit about this broadband risk mitigation tool that your organization has developed and talked about in your most recent newsletter. But I just thought to begin, just to kind of frame the picture a little bit, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see the state of climate mitigation efforts in rural America, and if there are, rural areas that are vulnerable to climate disasters like what we saw here in Vermont this past July.
Well, it's an important question, and certainly, as you mentioned, one that hits close to home. I think there is a wide variation in how communities have come to terms with the fact that our climate is changing and that we need to take action in order to make sure that we reduce carbon, but also to mitigate against the impacts that are facing us right here and right now. And those vary dramatically. In some places, it's flooding. In other places, it's extreme heat. In others, it is forest fires. And so there are a number of different ways that communities need to be ensuring that they're preparing for this climate future that we're facing, while hopeful also taking steps to try to mitigate the impacts and increase in carbon that is the genesis of all of it. What I would say is that the Biden administration has taken unprecedented steps to incorporate the issues of climate into so many pieces of their agenda. The Inflation Reduction Act has unprecedented amount of resources to go towards both the reduction of carbon through efficiency, development of renewable energy, but also underwriting innovation that can take place in our country to be able to tackle the problems ahead of us, and to do so with the ingenuity that we all know is what has made America the extraordinary place that it is. They've also built into their other efforts to support the economy and the infrastructure of our country that take into account the issues of climate change. And they're doing so in a way that's really unprecedented, which is what led to the map that you referenced.
Well, let's dive into this broadband risk mitigation tool that CORI has developed here. I guess probably the prelude to that is this BEAD program, or the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, federal program funded to the tune of roughly $42 billion. I guess it grows out of one of those acts of Congress that was passed in 2021, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, and how does the climate mitigation tool tie into that?
Sure. So the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that the $42 billion that the Biden administration and Congress put into the bipartisan infrastructure bill is an unprecedented amount of resources and is at the same level of the initiatives under the New Deal to bring rural electrification, to actually bring world-class, future-proof broadband to every American in our country. And for anyone who's known me in my various background and various hats and positions I've held, I've been talking about this for a long time, that we really need to make sure that places like rural Vermont have an equal footing for access to educational opportunities, the ability to work from home, especially during times of pandemics and others, but also to be able to give economic opportunity at large in the information age to rural entrepreneurs and technologists. And lo and behold, it unfortunately took a pandemic to do it, but we saw the will to put those resources forward. And getting it passed was a huge hurdle. Getting those resources deployed is now the execution challenge that the administration has, and that is going through the BEAD program and other programs as well. Actually, USDA has funding to help support broadband, as does Treasury. They were able to get some resources out even faster to make sure that states were able to put together at least the teams and the basic planning to prepare for this funding. Now, the part that I was mentioning before about the administration incorporating the issues of climate change into so many of their policies, it was on display with the regulations that they put out around the BEAD investment in broadband. And if I go back to my days when I was at Google and a part of the Google Fiber team, we were thinking about climate then. When you're making a 100-year infrastructure investment, you need to be thinking out 100 years. And the locations that Google Fiber chose, as well as the type of infrastructure deployment that was being used, was keeping in mind the realities of climate change that engineers at Google knew to be a fact, even back in 2011, 12, and 13. So fast forward to this unprecedented moment of funding, and the administration made it clear that any broadband implementation plan that a state was going to propose had to take into account what was happening and projected to happen on a climate basis before they finalized their plans. That makes a whole bunch of sense, because in some places it may mean you need to underground broadband. In other places, it means that maybe you should put the fiber up on poles because that would be better in that particular location. And then there are other kinds of approaches that can help what sometimes called hardening that infrastructure to make it resilient in the face of climate change moving forward. The challenge was they didn't provide a tool to be able to help local communities, and many of those local leaders that are on the front lines of trying to figure out how do they access these dollars to bring world-class broadband to the last mile of their municipality or county. So we partnered with Connect for Humanity, which is another nonprofit that is very involved in the broadband space and a collaborator of ours, to build this tool to address exactly that problem. From the very start of the Center on Rural Innovation, we have been data-driven, and we felt it was important to have the capacity to not only analyze data to understand what's happening in rural economies, but also to make that data useful, to make it something that could be visual, and that local nonprofits and economic development offices in rural places that usually don't have big staffs could access those kinds of data assets to be able to advance their communities. And this fit in perfectly. So being able to take our experience with broadband, being able to use publicly available data sets on the kinds of climate risks that various parts of the country are likely to face in the future, we were able to combine those into this tool so that the folks at the state and local level would be able to fulfill this piece of the BEAD application process and make the best decisions for the most effective and responsible use of those infrastructure dollars.
So then, in other words, I guess a policymaker or a planning director or town manager or whatever could punch in what their zip code or a group of zip codes into the tool and
exactly, as well as some recommendations for what that would mean for the kind of planning that they should do. Again, things like, should you really be investing in burying the fiber optic cables, both in the middle mile areas, but also along the roads to be able to get to those homes? Or are there other kinds of steps that you should take to make sure that your investment and our nation's investment in this connectivity is going to withstand the climate change reality that we're going to be facing?
I've often wondered, why not bury everything? It just seems like that would solve so many problems. Just little storms when the power would go out, or someone drives into a telephone pole or whatever and knocks the electricity out they were all just buried underground. That wouldn't be happening. But I suppose it's a lot more expensive to do that than just string them along a pole.
And it depends on where you are. We were confronting deploying fiber to the home in Tennessee, and it turned out that just under the surface was many feet of limestone, and it turns out trenching in limestone is very hard to do. So there are circumstances where you need to really take into account that cost benefit analysis. And when you're making those decisions, but it is important to be able to understand the context so that you can make that in a rational way. The other policy piece that's worth mentioning, because I think it's going to be brought up again in the state of Vermont, are things like dig once policies. So actually mandating that if you're digging up the roads and areas next to roads in order to put in sewer lines or new surfacing projects and those kinds of things, that's probably the time to put in conduit so that you can allow for easy deployment of both electric as well as fiber optic capacity underground. And it's always painful to me when I see a sewer project happening. They're digging up the area and they don't spend a little bit of extra dollars to put conduit in the ground next to those water lines to allow for that future purpose. So this is something that I think fits into a frugal Vermont frame, and hopefully will be something that the state considers encouraging, enforcing, and hopefully funding, especially with all the transportation dollars that are also coming with the Infrastructure Act.
We should probably have you tell us where the town or city manager could obtain this broadband climate risk mitigation tool?
You can certainly get it through our website, which is probably the fastest way to do it because it's the shortest URL, which is ruralinnovation.us. And we have a direct link to it there. And you can go right to that tool and be able to use it, explore your own community to understand that climate risk that's being projected. And you can also, through our website, give us feedback, which we welcome. We want to make sure that these tools are as effective as possible and user-friendly, so that the local leaders, whether it's at a communications union district level, at a city level, at a planning commission level, or even at the state level, can make the best use of it.
You know, it's funny when we first started talking about resilience in the wake of the flooding in July. You know, broadband resilience never struck me as being like part of that whole package. You know, it was more like how do we repair bridges and roadways and sewer systems and sort of reconfigure downtown so that the next time there's a once in a century flood every 12 years or so in the since between now and Irene, I think the damage wouldn't be so bad. But when I read your newsletter, it struck me, well, yeah, duh, of course, broadband resilience, that's a major part of it too. It occurred to me, this ties into another question I've had about thinking about resilience and kind of building back better. And you alluded to it there a moment ago in your answer to that last question, is that building back better is going to involve more money than just building back, right? It's going to be more expensive to build back better.
Well, I think the administration is certainly making its best effort to make that kind of money available. And again, we are living in unprecedented times when those resources to build the infrastructure for the future is available. And the bigger challenge for smaller communities is just being able to navigate all of those funding sources, to be able to figure out how their community fits within the parameters and guidance that's out there for these dollars, and then being able to have the capacity to do the federal compliance and appropriate contracting to be able to make those happen. That's a lot of the work that we do, particularly in the economic development space, less so in infrastructure outside of broadband. But those are the real issues that are facing folks. It's actually not a matter of resources being there. It's being able to have the bandwidth as a smaller community or a smaller planning commission to be able to go out and seize those resources that are intended for them, and then be able to do that really hard future-looking work to make sure that they are building for the future. I do think we've got some interesting and positive examples in Vermont, despite the impact of this last flooding, is that there were communities like Brandon that after the Irene flood took some pretty extraordinary steps to do culvert design and other kinds of water control plans in their downtown. And I think some felt at the time might be overkill, right? Irene, that's a once in 100-year occurrence. Why are you spending all this money on things? Well, it turns out it might not be 1 in 100 years. And the experience they had during this rain event of this last summer was much, much better. And they can credit that to the investment that they did make in that water drainage and culvert system that they put in place for the future. So there is the potential to do it. We've got examples of it. We've got money here now, but we also need to recognize that some of the solutions might be a lot more complicated and difficult. And I don't claim to be an expert in this kind of infrastructure or even in the topography of places like Montpelier. But my understanding is that there just aren't a lot of options in some places. And so they're needing to think way outside the box about how they prepare for the future. Obviously, the first thing we need to do is make sure that we're doing everything we can to reduce carbon moving forward, so this doesn't get worse and worse. But I think Vermonters are having those hard conversations about what they need to do to make sure that they're prepared for the future.
I mean, we all knew that broadband was important, but we didn't realize just how important when all of a sudden people had to work remotely or go to school remotely, and telemedicine was another function of that. How, sort of a two-part question here. How do you see broadband efforts going forward here in Vermont through the communication union districts that have been set up? And then as you've traveled around the rest of the country and gone to rural areas, what do you see happening out there in other parts of the country? Is broadband, high-speed broadband, future-proof broadband being developed and coming online quickly enough so that those rural economies that have struggled in recent years would be kind of areas that would be capable of generating more jobs and growing economies and keeping young people there, as opposed to moving to other places where there are more job opportunities?
Sure. One other point, as you mentioned, the importance of broadband for a variety of things. It's also important during disasters and a crisis, right? Having continuity of communication is very, very important. And we learned that certainly in Irene, where there were entire communities that were cut off. And that's part of the reason why, if we're building fiber to the home, to do it in a way that's really resilient to reduce the chances that someone could be cut off in terms of that kind of communications infrastructure. But back to your question about how Vermont is doing in this moment, the answer is it's doing really, really well. And part of that is Vermont has been, for the last 6-8 years, on the vanguard of setting up the policy infrastructure and the government infrastructure to be able to be ready for this moment where funding is here. I know for a long time there was a lot of frustration that the amount of money that was available to do broadband wasn't meeting the expectations and the hopes and even the policy proclamations that were being made. But it was just the fact that there wasn't that much money. Vermont was a small state, and it was difficult for private investors to see their way clear to making a bet on broadband to rural places. That's changed, and the groundwork that leadership in the legislature and in the governor's office took to be able to set up structures like communication union districts, which are unique in their nature in the country. The work that was done to make sure that we had experts in broadband at the state level, at the Department of Public Service, and now at the Broadband Board, so that they were ready to go when those resources were there. And the collaboration that has happened for a while, and experimentation, whether it was small telephone companies that went ahead and built fiber to the home to show that it was doable and viable, mostly in their territory footprint, but also places like EC Fiber that were able to demonstrate and troubleshoot what it meant to bring high-speed internet to dirt roads. So that once we had the chance to get those resources, Vermont was very quick to be able to apply to get those resources into the state, and they're now deploying. We're seeing broadband rolled out and connected in Addison County, down in Windham County. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary to see the speed of which it's been going out. That doesn't mean it's going to get everywhere overnight. This is a big infrastructure project, and supply chain issues are as much of a challenge as anything else. There was not an anticipation that there would be this much demand for fiber optic cable, and having the kind of industrial support to be able to produce that much fiber optic cable. It takes time to develop and grow. It's not something where you can just flip a switch. But it's happening quickly, and Vermont was in an excellent position to take advantage of it. It's a different story, and it's more varied. A state that didn't have a broadband office, literally did not have a part of their state that was focused on this problem that was particularly difficult in rural places. And so when the infrastructure bill passed and the BEAD funding was clearly on the way, they actually had to spin up that kind of capacity and expertise for the first time. And that's not easy to do in short order, especially when you're coming out of a pandemic. And it's a fairly specific type of expertise. You can't just go from knowing one kind of infrastructure work to saying, oh, I can just apply that to telecommunications infrastructure. You need to get people with that background and understanding. The other challenge that other states have faced is state laws that telecom incumbents had pushed through that really prohibited public-private partnerships, that made it illegal for public entities to work with private entities to bring high-speed internet into rural places. And it's incredibly frustrating for those states because there's not necessarily a lot of backing down happening from the lobbyists who had put in that legislation, because people who have monopolies like to keep those monopolies. And unfortunately, that has slowed things down dramatically. What we have seen, though, is first, a change of heart among some policymakers. Interestingly, ones from Republican-dominated states who are realizing that their conservative rural areas are the ones that are that are getting impacted by this kind of policy in negative ways. But what we're also seeing is the cooperative and municipal electric companies stepping up. Because in many cases, there is an exception for a cooperative or municipal electric company to be able to provide telecommunications infrastructure and even potentially to be an internet service provider. And the advantage that a cooperative electric company or municipal electric company has is that they've got a lot of the core infrastructure already in place. They have the poles. They own bucket trucks. They're able to go, they have people who can work on lines and do so quickly. They know their customers. And many of them were, all of them were created with a public purpose, which was that they wanted to bring electricity to their communities when the for-profit investor-owned electric companies weren't going to do it. So all of those pieces have come together to create a real renaissance in the role of cooperative and municipal electric companies to play a part in this connectivity work all across the nation. We've been directly involved in some of that work in Tennessee. We've been doing some work also in New Mexico. And it's exciting to see that willingness to go outside of the comfort zone of these larger utilities to be able to make this happen.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there for now. But again, thank you for making the time to talk to us about this very important subject. And again, folks who want to download the Broadband Climate Risk Mitigation Tool, I guess can go to your website, or maybe they can just Google that and they'll get there. And it's a very interesting tool. I was playing around with it a bit myself yesterday. A lot of fun.
Great.
Well, okay, Matt Dunne, thank you again. I really appreciate your time. And to all of you out there who have been watching, thank you for sharing part of your day with us. Hope you found the program interesting. We'll see you again the next time. Meanwhile, take care.